Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into something pretty major today, something happening right now that you definitely need to be aware of.
Yeah, definitely a big one. We're talking about, well, coral bleaching.
Right. But not just any coral bleaching. This time it's hitting two of Australia's most important, most famous reefs at the same time.
The Great Barrier Reef and Ningaloo Reef,
Hmm.
both World Heritage Sites and both struggling.
Exactly. And it's not just them. We're even seeing signs that Shark Bay could be affected too.
Oh, yeah.
This is a massive event, and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of some really in-depth reporting from Earth.org.
Great source for this kind of thing. They really get into the details.
Absolutely. So we're going to be breaking down just how serious this double whammy is,
Yeah.
what's actually causing it, and thinking about what it all means for these amazing ecosystems.
Because these reefs are vital, not just for Australia, but for the whole planet. They're biodiversity hotspots, they support local economies, and, well, they're just incredible natural wonders.
Yeah, and we're seeing them get hit hard. Right off the bat, the fact that both the Great Barrier Reef on the East Coast and Ningaloo Reef on the West Coast are bleaching at the same time, that's never happened before.
Unprecedented. We're in uncharted territory here.
And we're talking about huge stretches of coastline. On the Great Barrier Reef, we're seeing bleaching from the very tip Cape York all the way down south past Cairns to Townsville.
And on the other side of the continent, Ningaloo Reef is being hit from the Kimberley region down through the Pilbara. It's a massive, massive area.
The reports coming out of Ningaloo are especially worrying. I mean, they're not just seeing bleaching, they're already seeing coral death.
Yeah, that's the thing. Bleaching itself isn't necessarily a death sentence for coral, but it makes them very vulnerable. It's like,
Yeah.
if you're already sick, you're more likely to catch something else.
Exactly. And the numbers are scary. In those shallow northern lagoon areas of Ningaloo, up to 90% of the coral is bleached.
90%. Imagine that. It's a whole ecosystem on the brink. And, when coral is bleached, it's weakened, it's stressed. It can't get the nutrients it needs. It can't fight off disease. The report specifically mentions Drupella snails, these tiny snails that feed on coral tissue, and they can really do a lot of damage when the coral is already weak.
So it's like a 1-2 punch. The heat weakens them, then the snails come in and finish them off.
It's a tough situation, but
Okay.
there is a little bit of good news. There are some corals, even at Ningaloo, that seem to be handling the heat better than others.
Oh, that's interesting. Like they're just tougher.
Well, it might be something genetic. Maybe they have some kind of adaptation that lets them withstand the higher temperatures. If we can figure out what that is, it could be incredibly valuable for future conservation efforts.
Like we could potentially breed more resilient coral.
Exactly. But that's all way down the line. Right now, the focus has to be on understanding what's happening and trying to mitigate the damage. And speaking of damage, we can't forget about the Great Barrier Reef.
Right, is facing its own crisis. Bleaching is happening in the northern sections. And get this, this is the 6th major bleaching event for the Great Barrier Reef, just in the last 10 years.
6 events. It's incredible. And the data on the heat intensity is really alarming. We're seeing readings from 6 to 13-degree heating weeks in some areas.
Degree heating weeks, that sounds pretty technical.
It is, but it's an important measure. Basically, it tells you how much heat stress the coral has been exposed to over time. And those numbers, 6 to 13, that's really bad.
Okay, so we've got these two iconic reefs, both being hit by bleaching at the same time, both showing signs of serious damage. But why? What's at the root of all of this?
It all comes back to climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions are trapping heat in the atmosphere, and that heat is being absorbed by the oceans.
So the oceans are getting warmer, and that's what's stressing the coral.
Exactly. Corals have this symbiotic relationship with algae called zooxanthellae. They live inside the coral tissue and provide it with food and color. But when the water gets too warm, the coral expels the algae. That's what causes the bleaching, and it's really bad for the coral's health.
So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Greenhouse gases warm the oceans, the warmer oceans stress the coral expels the algae, and then the coral is left weak and vulnerable.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, those degree heating weeks we talked about, well, when an area hits 4 DHW, we start seeing serious bleaching. And at 8 DHW, the risk of coral death goes way up.
And Ningaloo is hitting 16.
16? That's just unheard of. It's really putting the entire ecosystem at risk.
The Earth.org report mentions that shallow water corals seem to be getting hit the worst. Why is that?
Well, think about it. Shallow water is often clearer, so more sunlight gets through. And while sunlight is good for coral in normal circumstances, when it's already stressed from the heat, that extra light can actually make things worse. Plus, shallow lagoons often have less water flow, so the warm water just sits there, cooking the coral.
So it's like a perfect storm of bad conditions.
It really is. And the surveys that have been done at Ningaloo are painting a pretty bleak picture. They looked at 21 different sites along the reef, and the worst damage was in a 30-kilometer stretch at the northern tip of Northwest Cape.
And it wasn't just the fragile, fast-growing corals that were affected, right? Even some of the tougher species were getting hit.
Yeah, that's what's really worrying. They saw bleaching in some of the slower-growing, normally more resilient species like Lobophilia, Favites, and Goniastria. That tells you how intense this heat wave is.
And the report even talks about the Porates corals, those massive ancient corals that can live for hundreds of years. They're supposed to be the toughest of the tough, and even they're struggling.
It's heartbreaking. Those Porates corals, they've lived through so much. They're like the old-growth forests of the reef. And to see them dying, it's a real sign that something is deeply wrong.
It sounds like nowhere is safe. Even those corals on the reef slopes, the ones that are exposed to more water flow, they're showing signs of bleaching too.
30 to 50% bleaching even in those areas. And on top of that, they're starting to see coral diseases like white band disease, which often pops up after heat waves. It's like the heat weakens the coral's immune system, and then these diseases can come in and take hold.
So we've talked about the immediate damage, the bleaching and the disease, but what about the long-term impacts? What does this mean for the future of these reefs?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is reproduction. For Ningaloo Reef, the timing of this heat wave is especially bad. Their main spawning event happens around 5 days after the March full moon, which is just a few weeks ago.
So they're trying to reproduce right when this massive heat wave hits.
Exactly. And if the coral is already stressed from the bleaching, they might not have the energy to reproduce properly. That could mean a lot fewer new corals being born, which would make it even harder for the reef to recover.
It's like a vicious cycle. The heat damages the coral, the damaged coral can't reproduce, and then there are even fewer corals to help the reef bounce back.
And it takes time for coral to reach sexual maturity. We're talking 3 to 6 years before they can reproduce. So if we keep having these major bleaching events every few years, we could lose whole generations of coral.
That's a terrifying thought. But the report did mention some healthy corals at the outer rim of the lagoon at Coral Bay. Some of them were even spawning.
Right, and that's a glimmer of hope. It suggests that there might be some pockets of resilience within the Ningaloo system. Those corals could be crucial for repopulating damaged areas.
So there's still a chance for recovery, but it's going to be a long and difficult road.
Absolutely, and we have to remember that this is all happening against the backdrop of climate change. Even if this particular heat wave subsides, the oceans are going to keep getting warmer.
So we could be looking at more frequent, more intense bleaching events in the future.
That's the scary reality. And the worst case scenario, the one we really need to avoid, is these simultaneous East and West Coast bleaching events becoming the new normal.
If that happens, the consequences for these reefs, for the biodiversity they support, for the economies that depend on them, it would be catastrophic.
We're talking about potential ecosystem collapse, loss of livelihoods, and a huge blow to Australia's natural heritage. It's a stark reminder of the stakes involved in addressing climate change.
So for everyone listening, especially those of you preparing for the UPSC exams, this is a real-world example of how climate change is impacting our planet right now. It's affecting ecosystems, it's affecting economies, it's affecting people's lives.
And it's a topic that's incredibly relevant to the UPSC syllabus, from environment and ecology to climate change and sustainable development. It's a complex issue with far-reaching consequences, and it's something that every UPSC aspirant needs to understand in depth.
We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of what's happening with these coral reefs. And if you're interested in learning more about this and other critical global issues, be sure to like and subscribe to our show. We also encourage you to leave a comment with any questions or topics you'd like us to explore in the future.
And remember, all of this information comes from earth.org, a fantastic resource for in-depth environmental reporting.
As you think about what you've learned today, consider this. If these iconic reefs, these World Heritage Sites, are being hit this hard, what does that mean for other more vulnerable ecosystems around the world? It's a sobering question, and it's one that we all need to be asking ourselves.
It's a call to action. We need to understand these issues, we need to talk about them, and we need to work together to find solutions. The future of our planet depends on it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.